Welcome to the Adventures of Alice and Bob, the podcast where we shine a light on the people shaping the cybersecurity landscape today. I'm delighted to be joined on this episode by Jason Haddix, a long-standing member of the security community with a history of successful exploits in bug bounty programs, gaining the #1 spot in BugCrowd in 2014. These days, Jason is hacker in charge at BuddoBot, a company that helps organizations shift their security from a reactive state to a proactive state, using ethical hackers and security engineers to simulate real-world attacks against the customer's environments and help them to understand the threats that they're facing today. To quote Jason's own Twitter bio, he has 18 years hacking experience, 10 years leadership experience, and is ex-Citrix, ex-Redspin, ex-Fortify, ex-HP, ex-Bug Bounty, and ex-Ubisoft. Now, the reason I'm quoting Jason's Twitter bio at you is that he's a great sharer of information and resources. So make sure you check out at J Haddix on Twitter, J Haddix on GitHub, and the Executive Offense newsletter, and of course, buddobot.com, buddobot.com. So Jason, welcome to the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, James. Really appreciate it.
And whereabouts are you joining us from today?
So I'm based out of Colorado. I'm in Aurora with my family, so my wife and my 3 children.
Fantastic. And how did you first become interested in technology and computers?
Oh, wow. I mean, I have been playing with tech for, pretty much my whole life. So I think when I was a small kid, I think I took apart a calculator just to see what I could, what the insides were like, and I think I fell in love with everything to do with, computers and tech probably from that moment on. But yeah, I mean, I've always been a computer kid, always into video games, always into topics around tech and stuff like that, ever since I was in grade school. So it's kind of like fell into it and then never left.
I always like to ask people, what was the first computer that you started off on?
So I started off on a, I used my neighbor's laptop. So my neighbor's father was a doctor, and he had, probably one of the first IBM laptops that I don't know what the spec was for it. It came with a huge docking system. My first computer I owned myself was a 486. It was an Acer model 486. So loved that machine. Rode it into the sunset, and then I remember several Christmases after I got a AMD Athlon, which was when the processor wars, the first version of the processor wars, where AMD had kind of won. I got an AMD Athlon, loved that machine for so long. It was great. So yeah, those are some of my highlight ones, my first ones.
So those early computers led you into the world of the internet and the world of Shadow Crew. So can you tell us a little bit about how that came about?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, my history, is probably a familiar one to a lot of people. On the first sort of kind of burgeoning internet, I think. So when the internet was, first coming out, piracy and bulletin boards and was part of the internet, right? I mean, you had your modem, you dialed into places, and you were in chat rooms, and you were also, sharing materials. And back in those days, it wasn't even really thought of as piracy. That's just kind of like one of the basic tenets of the internet. But as it grew, I grew when I was about, I would say 20 or close to 21. I was so close to 21. I wanted a fake ID basically, and so I did a Darknet Diaries episode on this. But the story is that I got a fake ID from a friend of mine in college to just go to bars locally, and I got it from him, and it was really poor quality, and I got busted at a bar trying to use it just to get in to have drinks with some of my older friends. And I got really frustrated, really frustrated, which is kind of like a thing that happens. And so I went on this tear. I was like, well, I'll just try to do this myself. Like it can't be that hard to make a fake ID. And so I started doing research, and I ended up landing on what back then was the earliest form of the dark web. It wasn't behind Tor or anything like that. It was just forums on the internet. And so this was Carter's Market, Shadow Crew, Counterfeit Library. These were some of the first underground sites that were trading illicit information about all kinds of stuff. So
And from that, you went on to then start as a minor vendor on Shadow Crew on those marketplaces. Is that right?
Yeah, so I was I mean I don't know if I would call myself like a super active vendor. I definitely participated in the forum aspect where I was trading information. I kind of treated it like an art project, honestly. I ended up investing in all of the printers, the laminates, the UV inks, the powders, the everything that goes along with building a good fake ID. Because when I do something, my ADHD doesn't allow me to do it halfway. So um, I definitely got really good and was sharing tips and tricks on the forums and stuff like that. But I wasn't selling many IDs in the forums. But they really did appreciate me on the forums for the amount I was sharing. So yeah, I would talk with other vendors, and so there's really three components of that ecosystem in the dark web. It is the hackers who are hacking the credit card numbers from websites, usually database dumps out of web hacks that they do. At least it was then, or network hacks. And then there's the carders who are taking those dumps and encoding them on a fake credit card that they make. But they also need an ID to match their fake name when they go to use the credit card at like a Best Buy or something like that. And it remains this way to this day. Is there's just like this trinity of people who make all that stuff work. And so me, silly kid trying to like learn how to make fake IDs just to get into a bar, I was a valuable commodity to them because I was sharing tips and tricks on part of that kind of trinity of what they did. And so I got to meet a lot of on the forums, a lot of the carters and a lot of the hackers on the other side. So that's when I started getting exposed to web hacking on Shadow Crew was during those days.
And how did you then take that kind of early interest and you're starting to learn about these new techniques? There's this information around, there's people willing to share with you. How did you then take that and sort of transition into a career as a penetration tester?
Yeah, so I was going to school. I was going to a community college in my hometown, and I was already on kind of a networking track there. I was on a Cisco networking track. I knew I wanted to do something in IT. I didn't know what though, and I was learning all this stuff. And it was just when web hacking was starting to become like a thing, right? So Rainforest Puppies' first paper on SQL injection had just come out like earlier that year, and I was learning all these crazy things like this bug called cross-site scripting, and like there was still there was still RCE, remote code execution, in web server software. Like Apache would still back then have a RCE every once in a while. So I was learning about like all kinds of stuff, and then Shadow Crew, the forum that I was primarily on, got busted by basically the Secret Service. Was the first three-letter, or not three-letter, but the first agency to really take a stand against kind of the underground forums. And Shadow Crew was the first one we busted. So basically, a whole bunch of people I knew on these forums got arrested in like a massive worldwide raid across the United States, Canada, Europe, basically everywhere, a coordinated raid. And I was such a small fry, and wasn't really participating in the sale too much of the forums, that I wasn't someone who was targeted for that. But definitely started to scare me straight a little bit. um, I went from there back to school and was trying to focus, and then I took an elective course at my college. And there was this elective course called Ethical Hacking and Network Defense. And my teacher at the time, I was taking the course, and I was like, hey, like I like the course, I like the ideas in the course, the things that we're learning, but it's already horribly outdated based on what I know from being on these forums. And I started to tell him, like this is the kind of stuff that's happening right now, and these are the attacks that are used in modern day. And he's like, you can do this as a job. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? He's like, there's this thing called, he's telling me this thing called penetration testing, and I'm like, what is that? And, so he basically, told me that, I can get paid legit for using these skills and learning about this. And your job would to be find these vulnerabilities and write reports about them. And so I took that course, and, did really well, and then really never looked back. From that point on, I was, I begged, borrowed, and stole everything I could on the topic of penetration testing in every facet of it: web, mobile, later on, IoT. I mean, basically everything that exists. Uh, just consuming all the content that exists, writing about it, and becoming part of the communities back then, the legit communities that were, propping up around DEF CON and things like that. And so that's kind of how I started my launch into my real career.
And how was that like first steps in the career? Because like you were saying, these were kind of almost relatively new things for companies to be taking on at a certain point. Like you didn't even know that there was the role of penetration tester, and a lot of companies were still kind of feeling their way out with that. Did you find you had a lot of room to just go off and explore new technologies, or were you kind of very much that we've got this project, it's got a very narrow scope, you need to focus on this piece?
I lucked out because I mean, any good career, right, is a combination of skill and luck, right? So I lucked out because there was a small consultancy right outside my town called Redspin, and so I had been working at this time for Citrix, just doing IT work. I had landed an IT job, which was my foot in the door for just IT, which I was so grateful for. Learned so much about just general IT, and they had it like they were lucky enough to have a security team, which not many companies had like a dedicated security team at this time, but Citrix did, and I got to know them too, and I would just bring them new stuff as like the lowly IT person that I would just bring them like new hacks and new stuff, and I'd be like, hey, did you know that we're vulnerable to this? And they're like, who is this kid? Like, tell him to go away. But I got to know them, and I got a little bit of exposure, and then I used, you know, my conversations with them and some things that I fixed at Citrix to interview at a job at Redspin, which was a full-time auditing and penetration testing consultancy. And it was really, I mean, when I call it like a consultancy, I mean, it was, like there was no more than four engineers when I started. Um, and I got really lucky because they serviced in California, they serviced most of the banks in California at that time. Most of the like mid-sized to large credit unions and some of the multinational banks too. And so I got to work on this kind of amazing team, and the people on this team now have gone on to do crazy stuff, like lead Apple's security program, and like I don't know what magic soup happened there because the people from that small little garage that we worked out of are now all over the industry leading it. But yeah, I got to work as part of a stellar team, and we taught each other, and we played in the DEF CON quals together, the DEF CON CTF qualifiers and stuff like that, and really got to be in this environment for a few years that was just rapid learning. And it was still at the burgeoning time of transitioning from many pen testers at that time were network only. So they were very
Sure.
used to using, something like Nessus and scanning stuff, and then actually having service-based exploits. At that time, still a lot of buffer overflows, like very generic stack-based buffer overflows. And we were transitioning into web, where like people were like, "Oh, you can break in through the website." And so I got to help Redspin build that methodology, and it was great. It was great to have this supporting like team who was all about it, and I've got some great stories from then. But yeah, that's kind of where it was.
Well, speaking of great stories and learning quickly on the job, one of the things I came across when doing the research for this was that you worked in a red team and you accidentally triggered an emergency response in LA. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how that activity came about and what happened there.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I do is I scrub obviously the name and any identifying information, but I do like to kind of share some of the better stories, in my career. And I've had a long career, so it's not that I have like, the best stories. I just have a long career, so you accumulate some. But one of my stories is, we were contracted at one of my jobs to do a red team assessment against a medical alert company, and this is the kind of company that your parents or your grandparents, would wear one of these devices so that if they fell or something happened, that they could pull the pin on it or press a button on it, and it will alert emergency response to bring, a private chartered like ambulance to their house, basically. And so there's several of these vendors, and we were contracted to test one, and it was a black box penetration test, red team assessment. So meaning that I didn't really get given um, any directions going in. It was like just see what you can do basically. So I spent, a majority of the, beginning of my time doing reconnaissance, which is one of my specialties in this industry, is finding all of the stuff that they had online, especially the stuff that they didn't know they had online. And so I ended up stumbling upon some servers of theirs that I could confirm were theirs, and one of them was a development server, and I knew that because it was in the name of the subdomain. It was dev something, right? So, and on that server were a bunch of what looked to be test APIs for, I was guessing it had to do something with, one of their web apps, but they weren't very strictly named. They weren't anything that I could really like, in my head, understand what these calls meant for this API. So, as a web hacker, you take every web app you have and you crawl it and you try to find its complete scope, and then you fuzz it basically. You throw payloads at it and you try to exploit it in different ways: SQL injection, cross-site scripting, local file includes, all types of OWASP top 10 web bugs. And so you're just trying to play with these URLs until something falls out, or you get a hunch that there is some kind of indicative vulnerability there. And so I was playing with this site I had found, and I was relatively feeling okay about it. I was starting to feel like, hey, I was getting output out of the API. It was giving me geolocation. What I thought it was giving me at the time was just geolocation of clients, of the company, and I thought it was just fake data. I mean, it turned out, and this still happens to this day, that it actually wasn't fake data. It was live data of their customer base. They had connected their dev to the same database that their prod was, their web app, their web API, and the fuzzing that I had started doing on some of these endpoints had started to trigger the medical response to a small subsection of the city of Los Angeles, because that is where this API was hitting, was that locale. So I was doing my work, and eventually, like towards the end of the day, I got a call on my cell phone. You have emergency contact information. The client can contact you if anything happens. I said, hey, did you happen to find anything? And I was like, well, I haven't really found anything. I've been, like testing, enumerating, fuzzing a little bit, but I haven't found too much. And they're like, well, the fleet of ambulances for most of the city just got called and sent out. Can you tell us what you were doing? And I was like, well, there's this dev app. It has a API on it. It was unauthenticated. I was fuzzing it. And they're like, oh yeah, that triggered, all of the ambulances basically we had in our fleet to go out to all of our customers. Can you please stop? I was like, yes, of course, I'll stop. And so, we figured out that, the devs had connected this development site to the production instance of the API as well, and they were managed to give a call, like to, like, all the driver dispatch to basically bring everybody back. But that was a pretty crazy one. Like, I ended up finding some bugs on that red team assessment that were really great. Obviously, that's a big one, is you shouldn't have that on the internet unauthenticated. But I will never forget that call of, like, yeah, you need to stop right away, because the ambulances are out right now. So that is the time I put the city of Los Angeles on alert a little bit, or at least everybody's parents.
And how did the company, like the company you're working for at the time and the company you were doing the test for, how did they actually handle it? Were they gracious about it, or were they angry about it?
Yeah. So this company in specific, the customer was great. They were they were like, yeah, this never should have been on the internet. Thank God you found it, and not somebody else. So, it can be hit or miss with companies, right? Like, some
Yeah.
companies really don't want you to find great stuff. They just want to have their pen test, and go about their business, and hopefully no criticals get found or something like that. And if you do find something critical, they can respond in the worst ways, either on a pen test or a bug bounty or a red team. This specific customer, though, was amazing, and they were like, They contracted with us for many, many years after this, and did many, many more tests. So, yeah, I enjoyed working with them, and that was a good experience. So.
And did it change the way you now think about things? Do you approach things in a different way, especially when there's obviously if you're dealing with systems where there's people's lives are sort of connected up to it, that can be a very different pen testing engagement to a more simple web app for an online retailer, perhaps. So
Yeah.
would you now approach that to try and de-risk it as much as possible?
So for that one, I was so young and new, right? So I think that's I didn't really think to ask the right questions in the scoping call, but nowadays, if the mission of the company was anything related to health, I ask a barrage of questions. Like, is there any chance that anything that I could hit could, cause like harm or anything like that? You should have some of these types of questions in your scoping document, right? To make sure that even if they think that they're all good and that there shouldn't be any way that you can do X, Y, and Z, you wanna avoid. And so, for an engagement like this, it probably would have been much better as what we call like a full knowledge or crystal box penetration test, right? Where they would have been like, okay, here's the full architecture of how this thing works, like how our business works. Here's the types of servers you're going to see. Everything's handled via these web APIs that we've built. The devices, make a call over like cellular data to this API, and like if they would have told me that, I would have known right away when I was testing this thing and be like, oh, okay, so this is the thing that the alerters connect to. Even though it says dev, I probably shouldn't be fuzzing it aggressively or spidering it aggressively. And if it would have been a clear box test, I probably would have given them a call and just been like, hey, I found this. It doesn't have any authentication. Do you want me to continue testing this? And maybe we could have caught it at that point. We could have been like, oh, yeah, first of all, that should be authenticated, even though it's a development server. And hopefully would have got to the point in the conversation where it's like, oh, actually, our development server is connected to our production system as well. And it actually does execute the calling of the fleet of the ambulances. So, yeah, so I mean, you would hope in a crystal box full knowledge test that you could get to some of those places with just talking with the tech team, and that's probably how I would approach a test with a more sensitive medical device manufacturer these days.
Yeah. Would there be like a line you'd just go, I'm not touching that system because either the customer doesn't really know what's going on with it, or it's just such high risk to a patient there that you just wouldn't engage?
Yeah, I mean, there's not much I won't hack, honestly. I usually draw the line on. Actually, I'm one of those testers that personally draws the line around. I have at least until now drawn the line at social. So I understand that social engineering is one of the biggest target, and I'm talking about voice, like vishing basically. So we have people on our team that do that, but I won't do it. Earlier in my career, I did a social engagement where I did some vishing, and the person who failed the vishing campaign, or a couple people who failed the vishing campaign for the client that I was working on, got fired from the engagement. And so I didn't want to be responsible for anybody losing their job. So I don't do social anymore. But as far as the medical stuff, no, I just make sure to do a lot of architecture questions before I do it now, and just say, hey, if you want me to test this MRI machine, I don't want to test one that's hooked up in a hospital where someone's going to be using it while I'm trying to hack it, right? Or I don't, like when I go into a hospital network, we spend a lot of time understanding where we're going to be at in the network and what we can and can't do and what the layout of the network looks like. We spend a ton more time on reconnaissance and enumeration than anything, just to make sure we don't bring anything down. We're so careful when it comes to testing those networks that have to do with very, very sensitive missions, basically.
And as well, you just mentioned that you have tried this sort of social engineering stuff in the past, but that's not your bag now. But I understand you've also done quite a bit of physical penetration testing in the past, and I've seen stories of breaking into banks wearing thrift store shirts, blow up dolls, falling through roofs. So maybe you could
Yeah.
share some of the highs and maybe some of the lows of physical pen testing as a career.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when I was getting in two of my jobs, every once in a while you'll get a full scope test, which includes physical. The client will want us, to go to, wherever. I mean, most of our stuff was web or network testing, but every once in a while you'd have a customer who'd want a full scope red team, and so we would incorporate, physical. And so I actually got the opportunity to go back to one of the jobs I previously worked at in my IT career to do their red team engagement. And so this is the blow up doll story that was on Darknet Diaries and some other places I've told it. But um, basically they had man trap style doors, so a set of doors on the outside that you could key card into, and then another set of doors on the inside. Um, and the inside doors, when you left the building as an employee, were automatically unlocked by a motion sensor, basically. And I knew this from having worked there, and so we would do all of our web hacking during the day, and then we'd go to the campus at night. Usually, when the security guard was changing shift duty, we had a window at about like 45 minutes where there was really no one on duty, or he was taking lunch and someone else was going to come on. And so what I needed was something to trigger would be to get far enough under the door um, to trigger the motion sensor on the other side that usually triggered when someone was leaving the building, because then I wouldn't need a key. It would just trigger the motion sensor and unlock the door. And so, I've seen so many other pen testers say they do this different ways. So the smart way to do it would have been to use an aerosol can. Actually, you can turn an air duster upside down and shoot out the kind of condensed air that comes out of that through the door, through the small door latch, and then it'll get far enough to trigger the motion sensor. And that's how people like who do this for a full-time job, all they do is physical pen testing, like Deviant, and there's some other really popular ones in kind of the DEF CON community. They have some of these cooler tricks. Back then, one of the things that we had, like in our arsenal was the blow up doll. And so we had a, a life-size-ish blow up doll where the place where you blow it up, like you would blow up a punching bag or a beach ball or anything like that, was on the foot. And so what you'd do is you'd shim this flat, depressed blow up doll under the door. You'd get it started with a hanger or a putty knife or something like that to get under, and you'd push it as far as you could, and then you would start blowing up the doll, and it would inflate on the other side. And so you're just face to the ground, blowing up this doll, looking completely ridiculous, until you hoped it got big enough to trigger the motion sensor, and you would wiggle it around, and it did. And so, as part of that test, it triggered the motion sensor. We were able to get through both sets of doors with the same trick. And then we were in, and from there it was a walk in the park. Once you were in, people's computers were still left logged in. We had complete access to the local network. We eventually got credentials to let us into the server room. And then, we were able to put sticky notes in some of the servers saying, "Hey, we were here," and everything was forfeit. So that was the blow up doll trick that we used a couple times there.
That's it. I mean, the idea that you were buying blow up dolls for research purposes and claiming these back from company expenses that must be one of the few industries and careers where you can legitimately do that. So it's a
Yeah.
fantastic example of just a bit of hacker ingenuity there to get around the system. So that was obviously a great success. You got in there. You sticky noted the server saying we were here. Haha. What about some of the low points? What? Because when people tell these stories of physical pen tests, it's often very exciting and glamorous, and actually the reality, especially with some of the recon side of things, can be a lot less glamorous than people expect, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, as part of physical pen testing, it's not all roses. And so a couple of the stories that I tell is, when I was low man on the totem pole and we had physicals with our engagements, sometimes the weather doesn't work with you, right? So it would be raining, and several of the banks that we did physicals for, be raining, and part of the physical is dumpster diving. Like you would never imagine how much you get from going through a company's trash. It is crazy how many times I found working credentials or PII or just a whole bunch of stuff that helped me on a test, like a software based, pen test by dumpster diving. But when you're dumpster diving, sometimes in the dumpster, right? There's no way to like just pull out the bags from the trash. You got to get in there because there's bags and bags and bags of stuff you have to get in. And so dumpster diving in the rain is one of my least favorite things to do, and I've had to do a couple times because you're wet. It makes everything that's sticky already more sticky. It makes everything that's smelly already more smelly. Usually it ruins your whole day when you're trying to do it. So, that's a big one. If you're lucky enough to, have the infrastructure set up, you just jump in there, grab as many bags as you can, and set them in a truck or a van that you have, and then take off and like rifle through that stuff later. But sometimes you'll come across when you're in the dumpster, like the bags are ripped or torn, and you have to look through them, right? Like this is your job, and so you're not going to take the ripped or torn bag and the loose leaf trash, and get that into the car. So really, you're digging through it in the rain, you've got Starbucks on your hands, you've got, somebody's leftover lunch. So that is one of the less glamorous parts of kind of the physical portions. The other one I talk about is falling through the roof. So many times when you're doing physical testing, this was more, I would say, years ago, right? A lot of times this particular vulnerability has been addressed in many build codes and sites. But earlier on in my career, when we did physicals, uh, one of the things would be people would have server rooms, and obviously they'd have controls and locks. And one of the ones we went through, we had gained access to the building, but we couldn't gain access to the server room, and it was one of the main objectives that we wanted to get to. So we basically hung out in a meeting room looking like we were consultants until it was time for the office to close. This was a multi-floor building and target, and so we just looked like we belonged, and we were chilling in this meeting room until about the time when everybody started to leave. And outside of the server room was a small coffee. I wouldn't even call it a coffee table. It's just a stand that they put flowers on and things like that. And so our plan was to check to see if the drop ceiling, if there was a physical barrier for the walling of the server room all the way up to the real plaster, or if the drop ceiling we would be able to crawl over the door frame. And this still happened, especially when people converted regular rooms into server rooms, right? They would they would change something into a server room, install AC and everything like this, but it was never meant to be a secure facilities room. And so we waited, and I don't know why I got picked because honestly I was the biggest guy, but whatever. So so I got picked by the team. So I get up on this little table and I pull myself up through move the tile, move it over. I'm crawling, on the drop ceiling, and usually you're careful when you're crawling on these drop ceilings because they're those tiles are made of basically like plaster or like not very strong material. I actually don't know what they're made of, but if you put any weight on them, they will crack in half. And so you make sure to try to put your weight on the supporting like metal brackets that hold them in place, and that way you don't fall. But luckily we had found that there was no physical separation between the walling of the server room and the outside hallway where we were, and I was able to go over the door frame and shimmy through a spot there. But in my attempted shimmy, I placed my knee on the wrong part of the tile, or at least too far to the left or the right, maybe an inch. And the tile cracked, and I ended up falling through the tile into into the server room. I felt kind of on my side-ish, which was lucky because I didn't break anything. It just knocked the wind out of me. It was like somewhat on my butt and somewhat on my side, which I guess I could have broken a hip, but I got super lucky that I didn't get injured. Knocked the air out of me, and then the partition or the door was like one place, and it was one of those doors where you have like a glass window next to it. So my other red team buddies are watching me through the glass, and they're just laughing their butts off about I have just fallen, and they're worried for me a little bit, but honestly like they were giggling so hard. And so this is like another portion of red teaming, is the hilarious and sometimes dangerous mistakes of like the physical portion, right? It's like it's nuts. And so yeah, I was able to unlock the door from the inside, and we got access, but not after a bruised ego and hip. So
Yeah, and having maybe attempted that activity myself before, you often find that's the dustiest place in the building as well. So you're not usually in a presentable
yes,
state after climbing through those ceiling voids.
nope, nope, absolutely not. Yeah.
Fantastic. So moving on from crawling through roof spaces and inflatable dolls onto your experiences in leadership and management. So you've served as the Chief Security Officer at Ubisoft, VP of Trust and Security at BugCrowd. You're now the Chief Information Security Officer and hacker in charge at your current company. What are the challenges and insights you've gained from those leadership roles, and how are they informed by your penetration and offensive security background?
You know, I love offensive security, and I think that's that particular viewpoint lets me prioritize a security program, especially how I feel real risk is across an organization. I feel like it gives me an edge there. In my time at HP, that was one of my employers. You know, the last part of my role was in leadership. So I learned a lot at HP about building teams and what to do and what not to do. I hired some of the best people in the industry. I built a great team at HP. We were like a startup inside of HP, so we were funded by, big HP, but we were bringing in a lot of money doing consulting work. It was a group called Shadow Labs, and it was amazing. So I learned a lot about building teams there, and then when I left HP, I went to BugCrowd, and then I learned a whole bunch about startup leadership and building startup teams, and grew into more technical security leadership there, security program, understanding like a security program, especially how it differs from a big company to a small company. And then I left BugCrowd to take my first kind of debut big CISO role, big security leader role at Ubisoft, because I'm a huge gamer, huge nerd, and I wanted to marry video gaming and security. And so I was able to go into Ubisoft having this context from an offensive security side to reprioritize the program, reorganize some stuff, really get them on better footing. But I was also exposed to several, security breaches. When you're that big of a company, you get exposed to, like breaches of all sizes, basically, and incidents of all sizes, and got a lot of exposure to the blue side of the house as well. Since I had been mostly offensive based, I got a lot of exposure to SOC and threat intelligence and detection engineering and all that stuff. Worked with some really great people at Ubisoft. So I feel like my career I've been so blessed because I've gotten exposure to pretty much everything. And I would say the combination of that soup has led me to a place now where I feel like I could go into, any situation, any business, big or small, startup, cloud native, not cloud native, legacy, and I could probably figure out, like how to design a good security program that's prioritized in the correct way. So that's usually what I tell people. I feel like, having those skills allows me to do that, which allows you to save budget, not waste time, build great teams. And I mean, I could talk for hours on each one of those topics, but yeah, those are some of the things I think that I came out with and I specialize in.
One of the things you mentioned there was that obviously during your time there, they were Ubisoft a big target that suffered, different breaches. The one that jumps to mind for me is obviously the attack from Lapsus, and while the threat actors weren't able to inflict the same amount of damage they had done on previous victims, it must have still been a very stressful time for you. How did you first become aware of it, and what did it feel like at the time going through that?
Yeah, so the Lapsus incident was one of the bigger ones I think that I dealt with at Ubisoft, and it's one that I actually have a talk on, a conference talk that I do today. It's called Tales from the Breach, a crash course in modern adversaries, and I did it at RSA, um, and it is kind of like it answers this question of basically what happened, but specifically, I got a call one day. I think it was a Thursday, maybe a Wednesday or Thursday. I can't remember exactly the day, but I got a call at like 6 a.m. and it started out as um, a page call from IT saying, "Hey, there's downtime. Basically, there's an issue. We there's some downtime with some of our servers. We're looking into it. So it wasn't a security issue right away, but process and procedure has you attach someone from the SOC as soon as something like that happens as a security attaché to anything that causes downtime. And so I got that call at 6, was up talking to other leaders because it was a significant it was a significant enough incident causing significant enough downtime. And then, probably 2 or 3 hours into, the downtime and IT and security and the SOC working on it, security realized that it was a security incident rather than just like some kind of technical error, right? Which had been the running prevailing theory for a little while. And so at that point, you have to mobilize the team. Basically, you have playbooks for different types of incidents, or hopefully you do. Hopefully, you have a playbook and you've tabletopped it and stuff like that. So you mobilize a lot of your blue team. The next thing you do is you bring in backup, depending on the scope of the breach, right? So you bring in an extra third-party consultancy, which you have to pre-budget in and talk to your leadership about. Like if something like this happens, you're going to bring in like a Mandiant or a Microsoft Dart or something like that. I actually don't think they're called Microsoft Dart anymore, but Microsoft's advanced, kind of forensics and detection team. And that backs up your already stellar blue team, right? Because when you have a breach like that, it's not about, if a consultancy is better. It's that you need a lot of help during that time, and you never have enough staff to deal with something like that. So you start mobilizing, you start doing the investigation and the response work. Obviously, there's a whole methodology associated to incident response, and so you kick that off. But yeah, it's very stressful for the whole team. In our case at Ubisoft, Lapsus brought us down for a little bit, which for a gaming company is the worst thing that could happen. Actually, it actually changed my whole perspective on how I design a security program. Up to that point, I had been designing security programs to protect us from exploits, right? And I had prioritized, at least in my mind, where exploits were that could cause the most damage. What I hadn't been prioritizing for a ton was the eventuality of downtime, right? And how that is actually the worst thing that can happen to any business, honestly. And many CISOs actually don't categorize or prioritize their programs to include that, right? They think the way I thought, which is in terms of, I could have a small data breach of or a small breach of confidentiality or privacy of my users. And while that's horrible and nobody wants that, it actually costs you as a security leader a lot less than having your websites go down and your services not running. And so it was an eye-opening experience.
Yeah, it's that balance, when we talk about the core tenets of information security, it's the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability. And often
Yes.
people are focusing on the first two,
Yep.
but actually when it comes to the business keeping running and money flowing through systems and doing all these things, we've seen some of the breaches against like Colonial Pipeline and things like that, where it wasn't the systems that pumped the oil that were disrupted, but actually because they didn't have the ability to sell the oil to customers and communicate with them, then suddenly everything else grinds to a halt and we see fuel shortages and things like that. So yeah, that availability component is always an interesting one to discuss. And the thing that I really like with your response, some organizations and some CISOs will panic and bury their head in the sand about it and try and do damage limitation. And what I liked with your approach was you got out there, like you say, you've got this talk, Tales from the Breach. It was presented at RSA. You reached out to other CISOs and you came and said, hey, here's the things that we've learned about these modern threat actors and the techniques they use. So maybe you could share like some high level thoughts. I know secrets management is one of the things you've talked about there and finding those. So maybe you could give some people some pointers on what they should be thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, so I mean, exactly what you said happened. During the tail end of the incident and the aftermath of it, you know, I had a great team at Ubisoft, tremendously talented people. I had both landed in there with tremendously talented people and had hired even more people onto that team. I had a great budget for a security program, multi millions of dollars, right? And I had all of the products and bells and whistles you could probably wish for that many companies wish that they had as part of their security program, and we still got owned basically. And so what I ended up doing was what I would do, as part of a hacking engagement or something like that, I went out and did recon, right? And in this world, it was basically jumping in every Slack channel that I was a part of. There's several CISO Slacks that are invite only that, when you're in this leadership kind of group, you get invited to, and ended up going into these Slacks with other companies who, were affected by this threat actor or threat actors similar to it, and just getting their phone numbers and calling them and having these hour-long conversations with these CISOs about how did this happen? Like, like where were our blind spots in these in these incidents? And so I must have talked to well, I would say I had about 15 meaningful phone calls with people who had dealt with this threat actor specifically because they had a laundry list of people they broke into: Microsoft, Okta, Nvidia, Samsung, a ton of companies, and some that are undocumented as well. But people came forward to talk about kind of what happened. And so I started building a dossier with threat intelligence and IOCs, basically, even though I was the CISO. But I just didn't want anybody to have to go through kind of what I went through, which was super painful. And so I started to get a picture of where our deficiencies were with through these conversations and through sharing the threat intel with the rest of these Slacks as well. Um, and we saved a couple companies where they were in the first stages of initial access from this threat actor. And the IOC package and the threat intel package that we built at Ubisoft actually was used in Microsoft's verbatim in one of their blogs for their bulletin on this threat actor. And so it was really great to kind of give back. So that was one thing I learned throughout the process, is that you're not alone. Usually these threat actors have targeted many people before you, and you can, one of the great things about the industry is that people are willing to help each other. And so we got a lot of information we're able to share and help a lot of people. Technically, the things that I learned a lot about, through Lapsus was the intricacies of, a Microsoft dominant, network, right? And how two-factor authentication works, how cookies work, kind of how the darknet market works. And so, you know, um, the threat actors, and in our case, bought the bot they're in. They bought it from a dark web market. At this time, it was Genesis Market, and then they used that credential, and not just the credential, but the cookie associated to one of our users to start their initial access. And then they pivoted through some very unique and novel ways, and then eventually ended up on the internal network. One of the things, out of the incident that was very apparent was that once they get past your hardened armor of your organization and they land on the inside, they were not the type of threat actor that installed a lot of tools. And this is um, very prevalent for threat actors these days. They will use what's called living off the land techniques to not install any software to do the things they need to do to accomplish their goals. Lapsus went even a step further. Is once they had access to the internal network, they didn't even use the traditional, what we call in the red teaming industry, like lol bins or anything like that. What they did is they sat on the inside network, and they did this to us and several other companies, and they just learned about the network. They went to every place documentation was. So they went to your Confluences, your Jiras. They looked through every access they had of Slack and Teams and OneNote, and they went everywhere they could to first understand your network. They didn't want to alert the SOC at all. And all of that just looks like regular user traffic when people are visiting those sites. And even if they're authenticated, a lot of times there's, you know, web exploits, but no one's ever going to see that on your internal network to just read documentation, right? That maybe they shouldn't have privileges to. But anyway, they spent a lot of time learning about our network, and trying to understand it better than we understood it. And they would collect all this information. What they were looking for eventually is someone to hard code a password. And so there are several technologies that they were looking at into, and finally they, in our case, they found one that allowed them to escalate privileges, and they didn't even use it as soon as they found it. They waited and they did more research, and then all at once, when they had decided that they had done enough research, they would use their credential, escalate privileges quickly, and then try to go after their main objective, which for us was to bring us down. Um, and so actually, I see a lot more threat actors, kind of pivoting to this style of hacking, right? It's not glamorous. It's not some custom C2 that a nation state is using, right? It's something that looks like normal user traffic, so it's very hard to defend against. And one of the defenses, that we had to come up with, and I had to also interview other CISOs was how to build a secrets management program, because we had some secret storage in the right place. We had some components of it, but really a holistic secrets management program is something that not a lot of companies have built yet, right? Even to this day. And so we really had to figure out first how to stop the bleeding, right? Basically developers had already committed secrets into repositories, documentation, the staff was sharing, all this stuff everywhere. And you could be any company and you could tell me all day that, oh, we don't do this, but I can guarantee you it happens inside of your organization, right? Like the sharing of secrets and passwords is, if you don't have a program to address it, it's happening even without you knowing. So the first step was to stop the bleeding and identify where all those had done. And so we, tasked our red team and our blue teams internally to scan things. And, we focused on repos first, and then we moved out to documentation. And then we moved out to how are we going to deal with private messaging and things like that. And then you have to move into prevention, in which case, you have to build a way for people to securely share secrets because obviously you need passwords sometimes to execute, different services, or you need certificates, or you need API keys, baked into code. And so like, how do you do that? Well, you use a vault type technology, right? To give them a secure place to do it. And then also when they try to commit it to one of your repos, you try to block that at the server side. And so we built a program, and so it's basically uh, prevent, detect, and respond, and then educate. And those were the four pillars of our secrets management program, and it still exists at Ubisoft to this day. Our DevSecOps team runs it, quarterbacks it. Our red team helps with it. Well, not my red team anymore. I love those folks, but I'm not there anymore. But yeah, so those teams work it, and we had to build that. And then when I went out into the industry and started talking to CISOs about it, they didn't have anything that mature or fleshed out, at least until like how you do it. And it wasn't until I really had talked to some people at I think one of the companies was a secrets management company, and I talked to them about like this model. They were like, that is absolutely what we tell people. We've never codified it into that, that visualization or talking about it before. So, people are now starting to realize that this has to be a program that you have to invest in, and I'm glad about that because it's really a big part of how most threat actors, once they break into, once they have initial access, um, what they look to do and how they look to escalate privileges is these hard-coded secrets on the internal.
That's really, really valuable insight. And I think, you're absolutely right. These are things that people kind of know about, but they're not really high enough up on their radar. They're not thinking of them in a joined up way. The whole sort of shift towards identity security, and we're often still thinking about endpoint security and exploits, rather than, users being compromised, what access they have. One of the things you mentioned there was obviously just defining, codifying things. So I know we're nearly at the end of our time here today, but one of the things that always pops into my head when I hear your name is the bug hunters methodology. So I was just curious how that came about, what problems you were trying to solve there by kind of codifying some of the methodology around hunting for bugs.
Yeah, this is rewinding a bit to my offensive days, and I'm still offensive today. I mean, I lead a red team, serve red team as a service company. So, but yeah, basically, bug bounty was starting to grow. And I had known some leaders at Bug Crowd and had been participating in bug bounties while I was the VP of our group at HP. And so this is at the point where um, I had worked my way up into the leaderboard number one position on Bug Crowd's leaderboard, and was pretty much addicted to bug bounties at that point, spending all my free time hacking these companies. Because you have to think of back in the day, the only other way you could work on other work was through what we call moonlighting in the industry, and you would have to get a contract set up. And the advent of bug bounty with HackerOne and Bug Crowd, it was amazing. You could just make extra money in your free time if you found stuff, and the companies wouldn't have you go through this long legal process. It was okayed through the intermediary, and so it was really fun. And what I started to realize is that penetration testing and what my training had been up to then had been good, but it was nothing compared to what the methodology was for someone who had to succeed to eat was. And what I mean by that is bug hunters don't get paid unless they find something, right? And so their methodology is focused on finding, like really impactful bug, vulnerabilities on these sites, especially on the external. And so I got, a crash course into like hardcore external testing. This was all at the time, this was burgeoning during the blogging and golden, what I would call Twitter years. And so I would collect tips and tricks, and I was kind of the first person to take a year's worth of research on all these tips and tricks of people I was, like peers with in this bug bounty scene, and codify it into a reconnaissance methodology and a web hacking methodology. And so my first talk at DEF CON was called How to Shot Web, with a little Spider-Man meme on it. And that was the first version of the bug hunters methodology. And then every year now, what I do is I collect bookmarks and research from talented people and tips and tricks of my own, and I basically do updates to that. So we're on version 5, I think, this year of the bug hunters methodology, and it has grown into a full scale workshop, and I can do 2 hours on it and train people on reconnaissance methodology for red teaming and bug bounty hunting, and application analysis on how to hack web apps and how to approach web apps for bug bounties and red teamers. So I've been doing that ever since, and I've been many years. I've presented at DEF CON, many years presented it at different conferences and stuff like that, and people seem to enjoy it. So yeah.
Yeah, I just think it's a fantastic resource to get out in the world and have all those things in one place and kind of a methodology around it and a clear start and an end point, so you're not just completely overwhelmed and daunted by, well, what do I do? What tools do I do? Where do I start?
Yep.
How do I get going? So those things are just fantastic, and many thanks for you for putting out those and many other things over the years for the community. It really, really is appreciated.
Yep.
We're almost out of time here today, but do you just want to share what you're up to these days and what you're doing over at BuddoBot?
Yeah, absolutely. So at BuddoBot, we are kind of basically putting out there into the world a red team as a service. I have a team that I've built there of exceptional offensive security engineers, and really what we're trying to do is bring the type of testing that I would want to simulate like a Lapsus or an egregor or some of the other type tier of threat actors. And so we do full scope testing, which is manual testing. We're not automating, it's not software. We're using real people to do real red team work. We include threat intel, attack surface management. So we're looking on the dark web for credentials, live credentials of your employees. We're finding all of your assets like I would, in a bug bounty program, and giving you that information. We do phishing and vishing. I don't do the vishing, but my team does, and we package all this up, this full scope red team testing, over a year-long service, and we sell this to our clients, of which we have a few. We work a lot with the government as well, so. 3-letter agencies and do this work, and it's really fun. I love red teaming because it brings some extra stuff that general penetration testing and bug bounty didn't, and so I get to learn about the current malware dev. In fact, I have a post going out a couple minutes about my adventures into learning how Mac implants work and how Mac C2 works and stuff like that. And so I am a lifelong offensive security learner, so I love this scene, and I'm trying to build a great team at BuddoBot. And if you're interested in working in the offensive security scene, we'll be hiring pretty soon for engineers. So if anybody wants to come talk to me, I'll be on Twitter. So
that's great. And where can people see that post you're about to put out?
It'll be on my Twitter. So I do all my information blast through Twitter. So it's twitter.com/jhaddix, JHADDIX. And I post all of my research and thoughts and cool stuff I find on my Twitter pretty constantly. And then eventually it ends up in my newsletter, which is called Executive Offense, which is an intersection between my offensive mind and kind of security leadership and how they blend together. And it's a newsletter that I put out every week.
That's great. Well, thank you very much for sharing that. And unfortunately, that's all we have time for on this episode of The Adventures of Alice and Bob. I'd like to thank our guest today, Jason Haddix, for sharing some of his journey with us today, from 486s and fake IDs to CISO and securing secrets with some blow-up dolls and falling through ceilings along the way. Jason continues to inspire a lot of us in the world of offensive security and bug bounty programs through his leadership, his knowledge, and primarily his desire to share all this with the wider community. And as I said earlier, And as Jason just mentioned, it's really worth checking out Jay Haddix on Twitter, on GitHub to see more of what Jason gets up to. I'd also like to shout out super producer Ben and the crew at Beyond Trust who make this podcast happen. I'm James Maud, and this has been The Adventures of Alice and Bob.